Hello and welcome to Chapter 10, Emotion and Motivation, here at Introduction to Psychology. Now, when we look at those two words, emotion and motivation, we see a Latin root presenting itself, miore, something like that, means to move. So we're talking about the essence of the human experience that moves us. When you hear a sad song or hear the soundtrack of a sad part of the movie or a scary part, the Jaws theme, if you're ever familiar with that, look it up. That tension building, emotion moving sort of aspect of music, for example, appeals to the things. We even use the word, I was moved by that scene or by that song. And when we think about motion, we get into the idea of motivation. Think to motive something that's going to push us forward. And these are tied together. As a psychotherapist, it's often very important to get beyond the logic of problem solving when it comes to fixing or addressing things in your life and getting into the emotional aspects of that. Thus, the classic statement, how are you feeling about that? And the real motivation for therapists to bring up emotion is because without an emotional connection, it's going to be more difficult for that individual to go through the kinds of changes and struggles that they will need to make in order to make their life better. So we often have to at least find the emotional component here that is going to give that individual energy to be able to move forward. Now, if you've ever seen the Disney Pixar movie Inside Out, that movie, with all of its psychological consultants that were involved in its production, fairly well depicts the first and then subsequent development of emotions. It's a clever way in which they display the first emotions that emerge, joy, and then sadness, and then we start getting into anger and disgust and anxiety or fear, and you see and that's how the movie plays out. These correlate to real basic emotions as the field of psychology sees them. So one other way that we can portray that is this in this emotion wheel. And you look, what I want you to focus on as we zoom in a little bit here, you look at the word joy at the top and you follow that ring around, and you're going to find each one and a few others of the emotions that were expressed in Inside Out. That ring represents the basic human emotions. As they move out, we're starting to see the various combinations of emotions that make things even more weird and difficult to understand. Let's look at these. The top, look at 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock here. We have joy, serenity on one side, trust, acceptance, and then the unification of those being love. Right down. Let's now look at 6 and 7 o'clock here. We have grief, sadness, pensiveness, loathing, disgust, boredom, giving us remorse. The inner circle are the extremes of these. The extreme of joy is ecstasy. The extreme of trust, admiration. Fear is terror. Surprise, amazement. Sadness, grief, disgust, loathing, anger, rage, anticipation, and vigilance. And often, many of us can consider that we've had combinations of emotions. That wheel comes from a particular theory and a particular model of identifying, describing emotional experiences. And the utility of this is when individuals feel conflicted. They may feel a number of emotions are jumbled together. So you can use a chart like this to track how you're feeling. Let's say you're somewhere, you're being distracted all the time. We'll look over here at 5 o'clock. You're being distracted and what's going on. Maybe what's your apprehension? Maybe your pensiveness. Let's move out. Let's look at is there some disapproval going on that you're feeling, some awe at the same time, but you're distracted, and you can kind of use words to describe the complexity of emotional experience. So this is sort of very, very cool descriptive aspect of emotions. The next thing I want to focus on is the relative skill that we have on managing emotions and understanding the emotions of others. Now, throughout the history of psychology, there's always been sort of an emphasis, not always, not way back with philosophers and stuff like that, but there's always been this leaning toward abnormal psych. If you ran into me someplace at the store and we're, gabbing a bit and you said, "What do you do for a living?" and I said, "I'm a psychologist," you would almost immediately assume that I see individuals for therapy or to help them get over their problems or work with people with mental illness or something like that. That is in fact not what I do. I teach and I do research on teaching itself. But that emphasis in psychology has always been there until, not that it's never been done, but until a new perspective started to arise in psychology called positive psychology, which was, if we're going to understand how relationships work, rather than study divorces, why don't we study people who have been together for 50 years? That would be cool. So now, the thing about that, the challenge of positive psychology, is that those individuals don't come to psychologists. They're doing fine. So we have to go to them. If you want to understand successful people, happy people, good relationships, we have to go to them because they tend not to be the one to show up at your office because things are going bad. So positive psychology took a perspective. I'm getting to a point here. Positive psychology began to examine what is it that makes people successful. And there's all kinds of factors, all kinds of reasons why individuals be successful. And they also looked at all kinds of different kind of success. Happiness, good relationships with kids, monetary, career, peak experiences, and all that stuff. For a long time, it was considered that intelligence, IQ, and its related skill sets were the key to being successful. And in fact, as the research was being done in positive psychology, it was found out that another factor actually played out a little bit more strongly, and that was coined emotional intelligence. That's the ability to manage your own emotions and to be able to understand and utilize the emotions of others, to seek an understanding between each other. So let's take a look at that concept of emotional intelligence, not only because it's the next part in understanding the full experience of emotions, but it's so closely connected to success. So here we have on the left, managing our emotions, how important it is for us to be able to have our own emotional world under some control. We're not lashing out, we're not exploding, we're not overreacting, those kinds of things. And then there's understanding emotions, and really that comes from, kind of goes back to my initial part of this lecture, the connection between emotion and motivation. It's our emotions that are going to drive us. We can't be cold-hearted and continue to be motivated in a way and achieve this happiness. That's what the research is telling us. So here we have understanding emotions, and then we use emotions both in ourselves and others in order to create scenarios for success, and of course perceiving emotions in others, using the cues that we understand to be related to emotional expression and began to help people get in touch with those. So here I talked about the categories of emotions that we have, and then we look at their utility, their functions. Having emotional intelligence allows us to manage our own emotions and others in order to motivate and move things in our world. So let's take a look at that other term, motivation itself. Now, motivation has its roots, this is way back in psychology, even when we're still talking a lot about abnormal psychology, what causes people to do what they do. Now, again, counter to the world of clinical psych, looking at individuals that make good decisions and are motivated to achieve and whatnot was a growing field in psychology that led to the development of the humanist perspective, even though the humanist perspective is not really considered so much its own school of thought anymore. It perseverates the entire field as a notion that removes the human being a couple steps away from the deterministic theories of the day of behaviorism or psychodynamic theory, which really placed the individual either as my behavior is the result of reinforcers and punishments, or my behavior is the result of unknown forces and energies of desire of the id competing with the superego, and I'm largely unaware of that. I need a therapist to help me work it out, kind of thing. Along came the humanists and developed notions of the human beings being much more a part of the process of managing their lives. They had agency. Now that word means I have the ability to act. I have agency in my own life. That develops over time among human beings. We have, when we're very small, we have very little agency. And as we grow, we're in this process of negotiating agency until we get into adulthood. And even then, we might, not quite be there. And we're just, maybe we're still working on some emotional intelligence, making good decisions. But we have an increasing notion of I'm in charge of me and what I do in the world and its effects. And I'm also responsible for the consequences of those actions. Now, a lot of that work was spearheaded by a guy by the name of Abraham Maslow. Now, Maslow's particular theory regarding motivation itself is probably the most famous model in psychology, and that is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, what he theorized is that we have a set of needs listed in this hierarchical triangle here, from basic needs all the way up to transcending needs like self-actualization. The key to understanding this theory is to understand that we aren't looking at the mountain and trying to get to the mountain by making our way through meeting our needs. The mountain draws us. That's really a deep part of understanding Maslow's theory. He felt human beings are drawn to transcend their humanity and become the best that they can be. The needs on the bottom are the barriers that they have to get through in order to get there. Kind of a different sense of the way of the world and the way of the universe, and the, kind of dealing maybe with some of the desires that each one of us have to be all we can be. That's why they use that in the advertising for the Army, right? Be all you can be. That is tagging right on this draw to be all I can be that he recognized in his theory. So here we have this model. We have basic psychological needs. Above that, we have safety needs. Again, above that, love and belonging. And then esteem. And finally, self-actualization. Now, early in his career, Maslow felt that these were pretty solid. You couldn't go to the next one unless you had at least in some way satisfied the ones below. So the path you had to take, the ladder you had to climb, can't skip any rungs. Now later in life, of course, there are many examples of people who, for the sake of love and belonging, put themselves at physiological risk. You run into a burning building to save your children. And he had to come to terms with the fact that these are more fluid than that. But the hierarchy remains the same in terms of what draws us forth. It's instructional. It's insightful. As a social worker, I actively use this as a model for the order in which I approach things, even though, even in that field, there is a substantial research that says esteem things like having a job, having connections and whatnot can sometimes be the force that draws people forward. And this is then initiated the current model within mental health, which is called work first. So rather than, in my day, working through physiological safety, love and belonging, and then esteem needs, getting a job, getting an education, let's put that first, and that will be a magnet that pulls the individual through, basically motivates them to do the other things. And that's actually turned out to be a very positive approach to working with that population. Maslow felt that most people didn't achieve self-actualization. If you've ever met someone who's self-actualized, now that you know this term, a person who's just has it together, they're with it, they know their stuff, they're just, kind of look up to those people. You can encounter them and they just seem to be a different type of individual. And we often strive to be like those individuals so that we can enjoy those benefits as well. Now, that's one model of what we would call about motivation. There's another one, and it has to do with achievement motivation and what comes into play when we are contemplating achieving things. Doesn't matter what they are, whether it's a good relationship, a nice house, good car, good career, a spiritual well-being, whatever it is, whatever's kind of creating that idea, staying within psychology. What are the factors that contribute to individual motivation? And how can, let's say, two people strive for the same thing, but maybe for different reasons? And we're left at the theory here, achievement and motivation. There are some motives that we learn from our society. Things that we value, positions that we want, education levels, what kind of car, what kind of friends, what kind of spiritual life do we want. We learn that those are important, and therefore we have built into us learned motives. They're internal, become part of who we are. There are social motives. Now they could be learned, but they could be because you've achieved particular things, you have recognition and status. Now, these can sometimes go hand in hand, and psychology doesn't really disqualify any of these as being one is better than the other. Pure motives of learning versus I want to be able to have a degree so people can admire me. We're not calling the value system on that. We're basically saying there are motivations related to recognition, social motives, and status within my group. And there's achievement, and they go hand in hand. If, for example, I'm a CNA and I want to have more power and recognition from my peers in my social group at the hospital, I might become a nurse. But separate from that, I might think getting a college degree and become a nurse is a great thing in and of itself, even though those two motives are happening at the same time. So, some other factors that come into play. Achievement motivation itself can be divided into a couple pieces here. We can look at power and control. When we achieve things, we get more power. Now, in another context, I've just been doing some work on teaching about stress and burnout and stuff like this. And oftentimes, stress and burnout relate to power. It's not so much that things are out of control or things happen. It's that you have no control over them. That's what sucks. And so understanding the need for power and control as much as we can feasibly really get. I mean, there's some philosophies about just how little control we have over things, but nonetheless, I may strive to achieve in order to feel more secure, in order to feel like I have a more handle on my time, more handles on my money, more handle on my social interactions, whether I can do things that I enjoy or whether I'm working all the time. My motivation might be to have more control over my own life and all of those aspects. So important aspects of achievement motivation. In addition to that, affiliation. This goes along with some of those social motives, achieving recognition, affiliation. I've always wanted to be, I'll admit, my pursuit of a doctorate was not financial. It couldn't be. It's too expensive. I'm never going to get that money back. It wasn't to get into a new job. It wasn't anything. I have always wanted that status. I've always wanted to be affiliated with individuals who had achieved that terminal degree. So for me, the motivation for that was, I love learning, got the learned motives there, the social recognition and status, and then also my affiliation with other people who I had always admired. I had looked at those individuals, held some of them up on a probably undeserving pedestal, but nonetheless, I wanted to be like them, and that was a big part of what motivated me to pursue that level of education. We also have here fear of failure, this concept that it might not work out plays into the whole additive components of motivation, what moves me. It's not uncommon for athletes to perform their best when they're facing failure. When it's coming right down the line, you got 5 more meters before that person who's right there is going to catch you on the run, and you get that extra burst of energy because failure is facing you right there. In fact, failure is actually an incredibly important part of growth and development. What it does is it sets goals. When an individual fails and they engage in a reflective process that we call failing forward, then failure itself becomes not a goal in itself, but when it happens, we turn it into an opportunity for recognizing our limits, recognizing what we can do about them, and achieving and striving stronger if that's the direction we want to keep going in. So fear of failure, the actual possibility of failing, an important part of motivation. Sadly, however, if fear of failure becomes overwhelming, if an individual's core identity becomes too attached to success, then that individual can engage in processes that are self-destructive. An individual can self-handicap. They can say, "Oh, I'll never do that." And by saying I'll never succeed, then I don't have to try, therefore I don't have to go through the pain of failure. That should remind you of something. I'm going to get to it in just a minute. But I can be so overwhelmed with the fear of failure that I can refuse to try, because at least with trying, at least if I don't try, then I don't really know whether I would have been successful in it. It's still, almost a Schrodinger's cat, or it's still out there. I don't know what the outcome is going to be. And I can convince myself, well, if I did it, I would have been successful. I just didn't do it. So I'm simplifying the failure as a lack of effort. And it's easier to swallow than actually trying and failing, which would mean I can't do it. And that's a bigger bite. Now, all of that attachment to success, the intense feeling of fear related to failure, and the conscious or unconscious conclusion that, well, if I don't try, I'm going to save face. I'll never fail per se based on my capacity to complete something. I'm only going to fail because I didn't do it. That is a root cause. There's multiple, a root cause of procrastination. Procrastination is connected to fear of failure. It is connected to the idea that we believe that we can succeed, but we are so scared of failure, we choose to not do it, or we choose to put it off till the last minute, or we don't do it at all. And at the end of the day, even though we have actually failed, we can save face by saying, well, the reason I failed is because I didn't do it. You probably all know some people who get into this habit. And it's very sad because it's a very, very self-destructive habit of self-handicapping, saying, either I can't do it, I'll never be able to do it, or I'm not going to do it because I'm fearful that I'm going to find out, and everybody else is going to find out that I can't do this. So I'm just not going to do it at all. That's sad. That's sad. There is hope for those individuals when they recognize that they're making a choice based on fear of failure. When you reconceptualize failure as an opportunity for growth as opposed to, a prison sentence for the rest of your life, be able to recognize that. In fact, let's go back to positive psychology, most of the individuals that were successful in life cite the times they failed as some of the most important turning points in their life. So failure itself, with the effort of trying, is actually an important part of success. And here, what a wide range we've got. We started with emotions, motivation, positive psych, fear of failure, how do we succeed and achieve, and here we are talking about, how do we make it in life and be the best we can be, and possibly some of us achieving that self-actualized way of being. I urge you, aside from this video, to look up other videos about these things. These are just so formative in my own philosophy of life. They're very important to me personally, and we're just skimming the surface in this class. So that's it for this chapter, and we'll see you next time.